Hello, it is Cengiz. This lecture will be about theoretical perspectives to visual cognition. There are multiple sources that I have used to compile these slides. Two of them are here. We had an idea of vision since the ancient times. If you go back to ancient Greek schools, you see so-called emission theory, and these thinkers of the time thought that vision was achieved by rays that emanate from the eyes. So when these rays intercept with objects, then vision occurs. So this was the idea. It is now difficult to understand what that means, but it was quite an expected framework of thinking at ancient Greek. And then there were opponents to that view. One of those opponents was the intromission theory. And in this theory, the thinkers thought that vision comes from the environment. So it should be something that represents the object itself. So this is more or less, the second one seems to be confirmed, because in our time we are also thinking the same way. Also anatomically, researchers, let's say, they were much aware of the anatomy of the eye. For instance, Al-Hasan, Ibn al-Haytham, he knew that the eye was like a pinhole camera, and he thought that light travels in straight lines. There are many other researchers in between, but I think the most important figure in physiological optics is Kepler, because he said that he developed the physiological optics, and he said that vision occurs through a picture of the visible things on the white concave surface of the retina. So this emphasis on the retina is quite sensible, because now we also think visual system in terms of three major components. One of them is the photons, light, and the other is the retinal image. Retinal image is the image at the back part of your eye. Here on the figure you see a cross-section of the eye, and retina is this back part. And finally, it is of course the brain. All these signals are converted to electrochemical signals, and they send to the brain, and the relevant visual regions of the brain process this information. So this is more or less the picture that we have more recently. And we know much about light, of course, compared to the past. So there is wavelength and amplitude that specify colors, and we also know about the eyeball and the optic nerve itself, which is a receptor system basically. And what we know is that this is again the cross-section of the eye, and the light rays pass through the cornea, and then they pass through the pupil. Then the pupil dilates in darkness, and it constricts in brightness. But what's happening is then that the light rays passes through this eyeball, and they hit onto the retina surface. Then these signals are all transformed into electrochemical signals and sent to the brain by means of the optic nerve that you see on the rightmost part of this figure. And on top of this, which was a description of so-called bottom-up visual perception, what we know is also that the concept of visual cognition includes top-down effects like experience, word knowledge, etc. So perception is subject to an interactionist account, and here in this context I mean the information processing approach. So it is not only that we perceive by photons that hit onto the retina, but also in the brain, the way that we shape perception is influenced by other factors like word knowledge and even goals and maybe psychological or let's say emotional mood, etc. And so this was the recent picture, but uh, it has a long story. I mean, there are multiple theoretical frameworks and like structuralism, Gestaltism, ecological optics, and so on. And I will mention some of them. And we want to learn about them because indeed visual cognition is a domain of research in which it is difficult to say right or wrong. I mean, for instance, structuralism, some aspects of it have been falsified, but you cannot totally falsify it. So we should learn from them. So this is the thing, because this has not been a domain of research that has been fully resolved. And you may think that, okay, science may be a continued process of collecting knowledge building, but it is not certain. I mean, at least what we know is that it is not kind of linear progression. Instead, we have a kind of patchwork. So, as visual cognition students, you should know that the older theories don't mean worse, or they don't mean narrower theories. Therefore, I will be a brief introduction. I will give a brief introduction to all of them. There's a very nice question that was asked by Kafka in 1935, and Kafka said that why do things look as they do? So the way that you answer this question actually gives many clues about your own scientific position in visual cognition research. So all these different theories answered this question in different ways. Some of them focused on the environment, whereas the others focused on organisms. Some focused on atomic aspects, so I mean atomism, and others thought that this is kind of a holistic system, so on and so forth. And to if you think about this further and further, you may also find yourself in one of these positions. So, for instance, if you say that things look as they do because the world is the way it is, then you focus on the environment. But if you say that things look as they do because our visual nervous system is the way it is, then actually you are focusing on the organism. So of course it is possible to say that both are applicable. What I mean here is that where is the emphasis? So in the first one, emphasis is on analyzing external stimulus conditions, but in the second one you would like to analyze nature of the organism. And maybe if you're following the first, or if you're closer to the first approach, then you would like to study the stimuli in the environment. But maybe if you are in the second track, then you may want to focus on, let's say, brain imaging. So these are different views. And of course, it is possible to develop an interactions account which says that both are correct. And if you follow up this way of thinking, you may also come across empiricist versus nativist stances. So here the major question is that do we really learn seeing, or are we born to see? So this is a nice summary of this two different views within the framework of visual cognition. So empiricist view says that things look as they do because we have learned to see them that way. So if we would born in another world with different structures, then we would see the environment in that way. But the opposing view, the nativist view, is quite different than that. And actually, if you are kind of nativist, you may want to study more how neural mechanisms develop in time. And of course, there is also an interactionist account, so-called, maybe you may call it interactionist account, which says that there are both genetic processes and social processes that provide visual perception. So another perspective, or let's say another dimension that defines these frameworks is that whether you have an atomistic perspective of visual perception or a holistic perspective. So the thing is this, it is in chemistry, for instance, it's very typical to study things in terms of their components, but you may also claim that, okay, it is actually the organization of the whole visual field rather than its components. So you will also see some examples of this in the incoming slides. So if you are kind of atomistic, then you may want to focus on pieces or bits of visual experience in local regions, or otherwise you may be kind of Gestaltists, and you may focus on the perceptual organization of the whole objects. And methodologically, actually, this is easier to think about because so-called introspectionism, which was more than 100 years ago, the researchers thought that by carefully thinking about our own visual experience, we would end up with a knowledge of visual perception, but this did not work quite well. So here, this you may hear the term phenomenological observation, etc. Phenomenological observations about our conscious experience. It was a fashion many times, many years ago, but it didn't end up with nice compatible theoretical, or let's say nice compatible empirical findings. For that reason, behaviorist view took over. I mean, it was able to provide objective measurements of human behavior. So if you bring all this stuff together, you may end up with a table. And now skip the principal analogy column recently, you will see what I mean. And if you fill this in, you will see tendencies that all these theoretical frameworks have shown. So for instance, structuralism was an empiricist account. It was also focusing on organism, and Gestaltism was a holistic account, etc., etc. So let me start with structuralism first now. They thought that the analogy was chemistry. What I mean is that in chemistry, there is matter, and matter is composed of molecules, and molecules are composed of atoms. And they thought that maybe there are sensory atoms. And these sensory atoms are associated, they're connected to other sensory atoms or their complexes in memory. For that reason, when I, let's say, see a part of a dog, let's say its head, then I would come up with the idea of its legs and etc. So this was basically the idea. And this also was, this, let's say, sensory atom was described in terms of their characteristics. For instance, maybe on the retinal image, they called it retinal mosaic. Maybe there was one sensory atom which gives the color to the perceived object, and by means of association, they were coming together and they were forming more and more complex perception. So this was the idea. This is similar to the formation of water out of their primitives like hydrogen and oxygen. So this was the idea. And this was the chemistry metaphor at that time. And if you think how they were thinking or how they were framing this theory, you may easily answer these questions. They were kind of empiricists. They were close to chemistry. They were focusing on atoms of perception. Of course, it is not certain. I mean, we don't know whether there are atoms of perception or not, but this was the approach. And they were focusing on the organism because they were talking about retinal mosaic, etc. And this was one of the theoretical framework. This framework has problems, mostly because it's methodology. But In At that time, the opposing framework got much stronger, which was called Gestaltism, and this was a reaction to structuralism. And Gestalt people, the pioneers were Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Köhler, Kurt Kafka. They focused on the configuration, perceptual organization, and their motto was first said, as far as we know, by Aristotle, who said that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And they gave many examples of this, and in many ways they were actually saying it correctly. So the basic idea again was that the whole cannot be reduced to parts, and the basic reason was that it was based on perception was based on the perception of emergent properties. So this is the keyword. Emergent properties were in their world. It was an emergent property was a feature of a configuration like curvature, like closure, like connectedness, orientation. So for instance, if you look at these figures on the left, what makes the curvature is not the blue circles, but their positions. I mean, their perceptual organizations. So this is then we perceive here curvature. We don't only perceive blue dots. And Wertheimer gave a very nice description of this framework. He said that I stand at the window and see a house, trees, sky. Theoretically, I might say that there were 327 brightnesses and nuances of color. Do I have 327? No, I have sky, house, and trees. So this is interesting because if you think about computer vision, which is based on processing of pixels, this object recognition is an important part of it nowadays. So this is a nice perspective that Gestalt people presented. What we perceive, I mean, at least consciously what we perceive is the objects rather than pixels. Gestalt people provided a sort of grouping, or let's set of laws. Sorry, it was one of them was the law of grouping. And it included law of proximity, which basically said that we perceive an assortment of objects if they're close to each other as forming a group. So this is very explicitly shown in this figure. Another figure was shown to describe the color similarity. It was called law of similarity. Color similarity was one of them. Another one was size similarity. Again, the issue here is that why do we group them? I mean, we have a tendency to perceive them in groups. So this is what they mean. It's a matter of perceptual organization. They say orientation similarity is another law of similarity, and even texture. These are, remember, these are all emergent properties in the Gestalt world. And it was another thing, law of common fate, and they say that objects are perceived as lines that move along the smoothest path. There are many of them. There are many of these Gestalt laws. They also propose the law of closure, as you see the figures on the left. I mean, we perceive the leftmost figure as a circle, and the next one is a rectangle, etc., etc. So even if they are not complete, we perceive them as complete figures. Another law from this Gestalt idea was the law of symmetry, and if there are things are symmetrical, for instance, here we have open brackets and closed brackets, so we perceive kind of three objects rather than four. I mean, it's also possible to perceive four objects if you take into account proximity only between those symbols. but they say 3 because of the law of symmetry. And to sum up, they focused on configurations, and maybe they followed the physics of their time. I mean, in that time, in 1920s, 1930s, force fields were popular in electricity and magnetism, and this force field was also about organization of the matter. I mean, it is not only atoms, but organization of the atoms in space. So they were emphasizing, they were making a similar assumption here, Gestaltist people too. So as I described now, you may think about this Gestaltism as a nativist approach, as a holistic approach, and they of course focused on the organism. The third framework that I want to introduce is ecological optics, and very basically its idea was to focus on the environment because this relationship between the brain and the environment was subject to an interesting analogy of that time. And here the approach can be summarized actually in a single sentence by Mays in 1977. It said that ask not what is inside your head, but what your head is inside of. So here the idea is that actually there is much more information than predicted in the environment. So for instance, three-dimensional world is not simply ambiguous, and the burden actually is not only on the brain and word knowledge to resolve all these ambiguities, but it is in the environment, because the proximal stimulus, I mean image on the retina, actually continuously change as we move. So even in simple textures, as you see in this figure on the bottom left, it is full of depth information. So Gibson focused on texture gradients, and he said that all these properties, I mean visual properties like depth, slant, object size, etc., actually it is already available in the environmental stimuli, let's say. He didn't like the term information. And he also said that these motion gradients are very important to understand visual perception. That is quite an interesting perspective. Um, and more interesting is the analogy that Gibson used. He said that this relationship between the external stimuli environment and the brain is achieved by mechanical resonance metaphor he used. So briefly, mechanical resonance means that physical structures have certain frequencies. These are structural frequencies, and if these frequencies overlap with the frequency in the environment, then they may be destructed. And the most clear example is given by the relationship between earthquakes and bridges. Bridges have certain structural frequencies. If their frequency matches with the frequency the frequency caused by the earthquake, then the bridges are destructed. But this is he thinks this kind of tuning. I mean, he says that maybe our brain has some tuning capacity, and it works like a tuner as a response to the stimuli in the environment. So this was the idea. And so to sum up, its focus one was the environment, and it actually did not have many followers, but other ideas from Gibson, like the theory of affordances, they have been used in other domains like robotics. But there is some truth in that. I mean, for instance, this tuning idea works very well in other more recent theories of visual cognition. So one of them is the spatial frequency theory of visual perception, and the other one is active vision that I want to mention in another lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.